Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today I'm sharing something a little different. This is a solo episode, just me talking about grief after a suicide death. The anniversary of my father's death is coming up this week as I record this for you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the process of grief that I've experienced over 34 years of dealing with a suicide death in hopes that someone may find it helpful to them. Perhaps someone who has experienced a suicide loss in their life is processing their own grief. I hope you find something here that's helpful to you, and maybe it's something you could learn about. Maybe there will be someone in your life that you could support who has experienced a suicide in their lives. I hope so. If you enjoy this content, please share it with other people. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast as well, wherever you happen to listen. And if you're so inclined, go to eoluniversity.com/support, and there you'll find 3 different ways you can make small financial contributions, which will help keep this channel and the End of Life University podcast on the air. So here we go with my presentation on grief after a suicide death. For this episode, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to share with you my own experiences with grief after the suicide death of my father. And the reason I'm doing this, on the one hand, is that this week is the anniversary of my dad's death. It will have been 34 years since he died. And so it's heavy on my mind, of course, this week as I go through this anniversary of his death, but also because I believe that still in our society, we don't talk about suicide often enough. And we definitely don't talk about grief after suicide. And I've learned for myself that not everyone understands the experience of grief after a suicide death, particularly if they haven't gone through it themselves. So those of us who have experienced it are the ones who really do need to show up and talk about it and share these experiences. And it's my hope that there are people listening out there who might find this helpful, who themselves have had a suicide death at some point in their own lives. I have found there aren't very many people I can talk to about it who thoroughly and deeply understand what it's like. And that's one reason why I feel like it's time to come forward and really share this experience and talk to people about what I've been through over these last 34 years. And obviously, I'm still, of course, processing and working through my grief over dad's death. And I will be for my entire lifetime. But that's true for most of us for all types of grief. It's just that suicide grief is rather unique in its own way. And that's why I feel like it's important to talk about. In addition, still, I believe there's a stigma about suicide. And what I'm aware of is that there are probably people who normally listen to every episode of this podcast who may choose not to listen to this one because of the title. When they find out what it's about, they simply may not want to listen to this story about suicide because it's challenging and it's difficult. It's still one of the great taboos in our society. So I understand that. I have compassion for everyone who has some fear or discomfort with this subject. And if you're here listening, I thank you for choosing to hear me out and to follow my story along for the next however many minutes it takes. And I appreciate it. I appreciate that you're open and that you're willing to hear about this. And I'm hoping that it will be helpful to you and that you may find that it helps you feel more comfortable if you ever need to assist someone who's going through a suicide death, and perhaps feel that you have a little bit more to offer. Now, I do have a talk I've given, a little workshop on suicide death, where I cover a lot of facts and statistics about suicide and also what to do after a suicide death. But this episode is not going to cover those things. That's a separate talk that I give today. It's specifically about my own grief process, what helped me or didn't help me, and thoughts I have about how to show up for someone who's grieving after a suicide death. So that's primarily what I'm talking about. I made some slides. So if you're interested in seeing the slides, you can go to YouTube and check out the video there. But it's not necessary. You can listen and you'll be able to get all the information you need from it. The slides actually are just to help me because I'm very uncomfortable sitting and looking at my own face on on video for the entire time. And so I can talk better if I can look at slides instead of looking at myself and thinking about why does my hair look like that today? So I'm going to start showing the slides. And again, if you're listening, you won't miss anything just by listening in. It's not necessary to see these slides. They're just kind of a helper for me as I talk. But you may enjoy the slides. They do have some pictures of my dad and me and my mom and a few personal things. So if you want to go to YouTube, there will be a link in the show notes for this episode at eolupodcast.com if you do want to check out the slides. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and taking a look at those slides right now. So again, I'm just calling this grief after a suicide death. And again, this is my personal story. And I just want to qualify that, we know that grief is a unique journey for everyone who experiences it. Even though grief is common, all of us will go through grief. Greek is unique to each person, though, how we negotiate it and navigate it. And certainly within my lifetime, my grief after my dad's suicide death is completely unique and unlike other grief experiences I have had. And so I'm assuming even if you're listening and you have had someone die by a suicide death, your experience may be totally different than mine. So I'm not claiming that what I went through is the same as what anyone else might experience after a suicide death. But I simply want to open our minds and open our hearts a little bit to think about what this experience is like and what someone we care about might need from us if they're going through this type of death. And also, I'm hoping that this feels like support somehow to anyone out there who right now is carrying the pain of a suicide death and struggling to find people who understand. I hope that you resonate with what I say and that you realize that, yes, if we've been through this similar experience, it's possible some of our grieving will be similar, and that at least we could look each other in the eye and feel a certain amount of understanding in this shared experience. So, this talk, of course, is dedicated in memory of my father, Clinton Wyatt. And so he died 34 years ago on May 11th. It's been a long, long time. And some people, I think, are a little bit shocked that I still talk about this grief as being really fresh and really present in my life, but I don't expect it to ever go away. Why would I? I expect it will always be something that's part of me and that I carry with me. But it has changed tremendously over the years, and I'll talk a little bit about that so that hopefully I can help you understand what this experience has been like. So this year, I am the same age my dad was when he died. And I think that's another reason why this feels very powerful to me right now, because suddenly I'm looking back and recognizing, like, oh my goodness, my dad really wasn't that old. He still had so much of life left at the time that he chose to end his life. And I see it differently now, even than I did then. I see the scope of his life in some ways differently because now I've reached the same age he was. And I'm nowhere near close to being ready to go. So, I see how much of the remainder of his life was lost in a way now, way more so than I could back when he died. So, this is my dad at my wedding. My dad was one of my favorite people in the world. He was quiet, gentle, kind. He had a deep soul, but also a deeply troubled soul. It was obvious to me he carried a lot of sadness and a lot of pain within him. I kind of knew that all my life, but I was very much like my dad and tended to also be quiet and also be someone who I could just enjoy sitting somewhere and not speaking at all. And my dad was much like that. And so I totally resonated with him. We felt very much alike, very similar. And so I just cherished and loved my dad dearly, um, and particularly his vulnerability and his gentleness and his kindness. And even after my dad died, I felt a tremendous need to protect him and to protect his vulnerability. So I got married around about 5 years before my dad died. No, 4 years, 4 years before my dad died. So this was my wedding in a quaint little chapel up in the mountains. And this is the wedding dance with my dad, which I look at this picture now and I see the pain and the sadness on my dad's face. You know, this is his only daughter's wedding, which was a joyous moment, but I still feel it and I realize like it was always there, always my whole life. I was aware of my dad carrying pain, and I see it so clearly in this picture. And again, I'm not sure at that time that I recognized it or knew that it was there, but I see it now. So, I got married. I I started a medical practice. I was a family practice doctor. I had 2 little children. My son was 2 in this picture. My daughter was just a few months old. And this was not too long before my dad's death. So I had these 2 precious little babies at home, and I was working not quite full time as a family practice doctor. At that time, I was taking my baby to work with me because I was breastfeeding. And so she came to the office with me every day, and my son was nearby with a babysitter during the office. And I worked, I think, 3 days a week at that time, but I was very, very busy in my family practice clinic. And so had a busy, full life. And then one day I was at work in my office seeing a patient when I got a message that my brother was on the phone. And he said to me, "Dad died today." And he told me that our father had shot himself in the head in our garage at home. My mom wasn't home, but she came home a little bit later in the afternoon, apparently after grocery shopping. Um, and opened the garage door to see his body lying on the floor of the garage. Now, it was a an unbelievable, incredible, tremendous, huge shock, of course, to get this information in that moment, but it was not a total surprise because I had known for a few months that my dad was dealing with severe anxiety. He came for a visit after my baby daughter was born and told me that he was dealing with anxiety and some depression, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. And I'd been working with him, getting him in with a psychiatrist, trying to help out with medication, talking to him on the phone constantly, and helped with the psychiatrist to get him hospitalized for a month before he died, when it became obvious that he was suicidal and had a very strong intent to take his own life. So I knew this was going on, and I knew that his death was a possibility. And even still, it was an enormous shock on the day that it happened and the day that I heard the news. I was completely blown apart and devastated to hear that news, and also felt like somehow he had slipped through my fingers, that I'd been working for months with him and trying to hold on to him and trying to keep him here, trying to figure out what he needed and what it would take and how to help him. And yet he slipped through my fingers anyway, and he was gone. And so that day, I will just never forget the overwhelming pain of that phone call and learning that he had died. And we lived several hundred miles away. You know, we came home and packed our suitcases and got things ready, packed up the children's clothes and toys to drive back home, to go be there for my dad's funeral. And that first night after dad died, I didn't really sleep at all, but I was lying in bed looking up at the ceiling, and I heard my dad's voice say, "I didn't mean to hurt you." And that has stayed with me forever, this understanding that my dad didn't mean to hurt me, and seemingly didn't know that this would hurt so much. Somehow he had not been able to glean that or recognize that. But I remember thinking, but you did hurt me. You didn't mean to, but you did. So immediately after my dad died, and I would say for an entire year after dad died, here's what happened. We went back home for his funeral. Um, our family gathered at my aunt's house. She lived just down the street from my mom and dad. We all gathered at her house. Her house was overflowing with food. People showed up amazingly, and they brought all kinds of food, ham and little rolls and salads and cookies and fruit, all kinds of things, crackers and cheese, like things that were easy to eat. And I remember it so clearly. When we were at my aunt's house, we could just walk in the kitchen and there was always something sitting there. If I felt hungry or needed to eat something, I could grab something, a piece of an apple, a few grapes, some cheese. There was something there to eat whenever I needed to eat it. We didn't have to prepare anything. It was easy food. And for that entire week, we felt very supported while we were at home, with all the food that was there. I stayed with my husband and two kids at my cousin's home, and she took care of us as well. She cooked meals for us. She helped watch the kids when I needed to go to the funeral home. She stayed up late with me at night. She was amazing. She helped me in so many ways. I will never forget that, and never forget um, how beautiful her love and support was, that I received right after dad's death. And that lasted, for a whole week. We were there. We had dad's funeral. Um, I helped my mom clean out his closet, which was very painful to go through. But then we had to go back home because I only had a week off work. I had taken 1 week off from my clinic. Same with my husband, also a doctor. He had also taken a week off. But the issue is, when you're in private practice, you have to see patients to bring money in, and you have to pay rent and pay your employees, and you have a billing service and cleaning service to pay all kinds of bills and expenses. So to take unplanned time off is very challenging. So I had 1 week off for dad's funeral and had to go right back and get right back into my routine and go to work. And I was a busy, popular doctor. My schedule was booked 6 months in advance, which means nearly every slot in the on the calendar was filled with an appointment up for 6 months. But the few I saved a few open spots that I kept open each day. Those got booked up right away, because for the week I was gone, I had to reschedule all of those patients from that week into the upcoming weeks in my schedule. So once again, I came back home to this very full schedule of patients at my clinic, still with my two kids to take care of, a house to maintain, family to feed. And so I immediately just plunged into work. I just immediately had to get back to my life, doing what I had always done. There wasn't an opportunity for me to take time off, to be alone and sit with my grief at all. And in a way, this felt good to me. It felt good. I had a total distraction. I could go to work and focus on patients and get really steeped in their care and just compartmentalize my grief. But what happened is that I didn't really deal with my grief for that first year. I stayed in a state of numbness in a way, and I compartmentalized the grief. I was barely functioning, but I was functioning. I was getting through it. I was seeing my patients. I was actually giving pretty decent care to them. I was taking care of my kids. I still worry about what kind of harm was done to them by so early in their lives, by having a mom who was grieving and who was, not emotionally fully present or able to be fully present during those years. I'm still worried about it. I still talk to them and ask about it all the time. Um, but I did it. I took care of them. I took good care of my kids, managed my practice, took care of my home, but I was just barely making it. And the thing I needed help with more than anything, and I can't emphasize this enough, is food. And sometimes I hear grief counselors say, "Oh, it's passe to bring food to someone who's grieving. Like no one really cares about that." But I did. I did. I remembered having food available when we were at my aunt's house for that week after dad died, and I missed it, and that's what I needed. And I did have a few people in my life who showed up with food for me and my family, and I remember it so clearly, and it was the best tasting, most healing thing I've ever eaten. It was amazing and wonderful, but not very many people showed up with food. Here's why not very many people showed up: because I didn't call anyone, any of my friends, and tell them about my dad's death after he died. So most of them found out by word of mouth from someone else telling them my dad died. They didn't hear it from me. And here's the reason why: because I could not talk about it. I couldn't use the word suicide. I couldn't say the word suicide for several years after dad died. And I could not tell anyone the story. Part of it was the stigma that still existed and is still here today about suicide. I couldn't bear the thought that if I told someone about my dad's death and the manner of his death, they would immediately judge him. I was sure of that. They would judge him as being mentally ill, or a selfish person, or a very sick person, or a lazy person, or somehow. I couldn't bear the thought that someone would judge my dad when I understood just how vulnerable he was, just how fragile he was. And I understood so many of the factors involved in his death. And I couldn't stand the thought that I would expose him to someone else judging him or shaming him or blaming him for his death. That was unthinkable to me. The pain of that was unbearable. So I didn't want to tell someone about his death who might say something to me that would be hurtful toward my dad. And I needed to protect him. And I needed to protect myself as well, because as a doctor, I felt that there was a lot of shame for me to carry, because I'm a doctor who studied behavioral medicine as part of my residency, and I didn't manage to help my dad with his suicide. So I was very fearful of judgment and shame and blame, and I needed to hold it all inside and protect the story. I also felt if I ever had to tell the story to someone, I immediately felt re-traumatized, as if just talking about it and just telling someone the circumstances of my dad's death, it brought me right back into the trauma of the moment, and I couldn't take it. I just couldn't handle it. So I did not tell any of my friends that my dad died or how he died. Our closest friends found out because we were supposed to go to their house for dinner on the weekend that we were driving back home for my dad's funeral, and I asked my husband to just call and tell them we wouldn't be able to make it to dinner because my dad had died, but not to say anything else about how he died or what the circumstances were. That's all they knew. They ended up spreading the word to other people, but I think it felt very strange to all of them that I didn't say anything. I didn't call them. I didn't tell them anything. And that left them wondering, what do we do? Why are you not talking about it? Why are you not telling us anything? And what could we do? And so the truth is, very few people showed up after my dad died, in contrast to my aunt's house, where so many people from my mom's church and my aunt's church brought food over. There was very few people showed up with anything. And the things that I remember that made a difference to me, number one, the people who did bring food, a few people. I remember a woman who brought this amazing pot of soup, and it was incredible. And another person brought us a dinner. Um, I remember when someone came and just cleaned my house. She didn't say a word. She walked in the door with her vacuum and she vacuumed and dusted, cleaned all the bathrooms, and left and didn't say anything to me. And it was amazing. It was wonderful. I needed that help so much, and I needed more of it. But I couldn't ask for it. I couldn't tell anyone that that's what I needed. I could have used help with childcare, perhaps someone saying, I'll stay with your kids if you want to go for a walk, or if there's something that you need to do. On the days that I was off and at home with my kids, I could have used a little bit of help there, but I didn't get that. The one thing I did get is my friend that we were supposed to have dinner with several months after my dad died. She called and asked if I would like to go for a walk, and she had a daughter about the same age as my son. So we took our strollers and our babies and we went for a walk around a pond in a park near us, and we didn't talk the entire time. We just walked together, and that was wonderful. um the the people who were able to come and be there for me but not ask me questions or pry for information made the biggest difference to me. I needed silence. I needed to be allowed to not talk about it for quite some time. So those are the things I needed. I got a little bit of that kind of help, and it was amazing, the help that I did get. I could have used more. For the most part, every day I felt like I was barely hanging on and barely getting through the day. And the fact is that we ate delivery pizza and takeout Chinese food often, very often, because it was so hard to put together a grocery list, to sit down and think of a menu for the week and put together a grocery list and then go shopping for the food and then cook the food. That was really overwhelming for me. So I did a little bit of cooking when I could manage it on the weekends, but oftentimes we just subsisted on, whatever takeout food we could get the most easily that was nearby. So, um, I I completely disagree with people who say, "Oh, food is passé, don't bring food." At least offer food, because you never know. Someone grieving may be in the situation I was in. I had a husband and kids and I was working, and food, when it was offered, made all the difference. That was very helpful, and I felt very loved when food was given to us. So I always offer people food. I always ask if I can bring food and what might be needed. What do you have already? What would help out? What would fill in? What do you need from me? So those are some of my thoughts about immediately after my dad died. And I say immediately, but I'm actually talking about a full year. This entire year after he died, that I was barely hanging on, barely making it, going to work, taking care of my kids, doing my routine. Still, I was compartmentalizing my grief. I was not really feeling the pain of it. I was in a numb state. So, because so much of me was walled off and protected, it left whatever remainder I had to go to work every day and show up for my patients and be there and take care of my kids. I did it. I managed it and I got through it. Um, but it would have been nice to have more support than I had. Again, I take responsibility because I didn't know how to ask for it or how to talk about it. Part of that comes from my own lack of education around suicide and even the stigma and the shame that I felt myself about suicide. And so I could have used more education and more support about suicide, around suicide death, and around the grieving process for myself. I was a doctor, I was trained in family medicine, but I had zero training in grief, zero training around death or dying. A little bit of behavioral medicine training about anxiety, depression, and suicide, but that honestly was not very helpful to me, the training I had received. So I was like any other person, uneducated about suicide and grief. And looking back, I liken the grief experience I had as to being a tidal wave, really, of just this enormous tsunami of emotion that could just wash over me at times and completely pull me under, completely take me down. And this in particular started happening about 1 year, around the 1 year anniversary of my dad's death, because that is when suddenly, for whatever reason, the shock seemed to wear off. The shock and numbness that had been helping me get through every day and keep my grief compartmentalized. When I woke up and it had been 1 year since my dad died, suddenly that numbness, the calming, soothing numbness that I had felt before was gone, and I was left with the pain of grief. So the beginning of the second year was even worse than the first year had been in terms of actually feeling the pain and actually every day having to deal with this overwhelming tsunami of pain, as I call it, that just washed over me and pulled me under. I had made it through a year and functioned for a year, and I'd even kind of developed some systems that helped me. So I was able to cook a little more and able to function. And so it was at that time when I was doing just slightly better that the pain came. The grief hit me full on. And now I had something new I had to deal with every day, this incredible pain of grief. And this picture speaks out to me so much, drowning a million times over and over and over again, feeling like I was drowning. And then just at the last minute, barely being able to pull my head above the water and somehow rise above and get on top of it again. Only a little later in the day to get pulled under again. And it happened over and over and over again. And this really began with year two. This really intense suffering and pain from grieving. But again, I kept working, still working, still taking care of my kids who were a little bit, 1 year older. So that was helpful. Um, and again, as I said, I had developed some routines. So I was able to get through the day to day work of my life a little bit more easily. But now I had this intense painful emotion overwhelming me every single day. And one thing I did was I began writing, and I had always journaled since I was a kid. So I got out my journal and decided I need to write, and I found writing to be really helpful. I would get up really early in the morning while my kids were still asleep and write in my journal. And I found that writing was one of the most helpful things for the pain I would feel. And I often just did free form writing. I would write down anything that was in my head and just write and write and write and fill up pages in the morning. But it helped me release. It was an outlet for all of the pain that was happening within me. Eventually, I started writing poems, and then I started writing stories as well. I was I wrote a lot of stories about things that happened in the past, but I could not write particularly specifically about my dad's death or my grief. However, it seemed like every story I tried to write that had nothing to do with his death or grief almost always ended up with grief, ended up at this place again of his death and his grief. My stories sort of meandered and would come to this place. Um, but I realized I needed to just write the stories however they came. So I didn't intentionally try to write about grief, but I ended up writing about it more often than I expected to. And so again, this was pretty much a daily practice. I would get up very early, write and write and write whatever needed to come out, whatever I needed to say. And I really credit writing with helping save my sanity in those years. Eventually, eventually I collected the stories that I wrote into this book, A Matter of Life and Death: Stories to Heal Loss and Grief. So it's full of all of these stories and poems that I wrote during those years when I was grieving, those early years of my grief. So lots of them don't talk about grief necessarily, but they were a product of my time of grieving. And it's kind of interesting now for me to look back at those stories and to see my own journey through grief. I wrote them over a number of years um, during my grief process. But that was the very first thing I ever self-published, this book of stories. And actually, I'm planning to re-release it and republish it in the near future because I can do a little bit better job of formatting and create a nicer product from it than I could at that time. But that was the outcome of all of that writing that I did, and it was so helpful. I cannot say enough about it. It made such a big difference for me. I also started practicing yoga. I got some yoga videos, so I would just do it at home. So my morning routine, sometimes I'd get up around 4:30, write in my journal for maybe an hour, do yoga for a half an hour, which I also found to be very helpful to me. It was helping me embody my grief in a sense and process the grief in my body. I also did cardio, so I ran or cycled most days. Also, I ran at home on a treadmill, but the yoga, stretching, and just the slow body focused movement and the breathing of yoga was extremely helpful to me. And partly through yoga, I began a meditation practice. And so this led me to begin developing a daily spiritual practice between writing, yoga, meditation. Um, I began reading books, things that could help me process the idea of grief and pain. And this daily practice became the place where I was most comfortable looking at my grief. And the more I used my daily practice time as the place to process my grief, the more I was able to function a little bit better in other areas of my life. So I created an outlet and a safe space and container for grieving. However, I know now I was still just barely touching the surface of my grief. This shattering grief is so deep that it takes years to get to all the layers of it. So I realize now, at the time I thought, oh, I'm doing such a good job with my grieving. I've created this practice and this spiritual practice, and it's helping me. And yet I was only at the very beginning and at the surface layer of grief. And in retrospect, I see that now. I didn't know that at the time. So for the year 2 and year 3 of my grief, I carried on with these practices that were really helping me. and making a difference for me, but I still could have used other help. And what I needed these years after the first year, I still could have used some food, let me tell you. It still would have been nice to have somebody show up with a casserole every now and then. I would never have turned it down, and it would have made a big difference, or even just having some food in the freezer, that I could thaw out to make meal preparation easier. And it's challenging when you have a lot on your plate and a lot going on, and you're just emotionally spent, to be the provider of food for your family. It's a big job. So more food would have been really nice, and help with childcare. And so I would say this: if you're helping someone who's grieving, who has children, if you can offer, like, hey, I'll take your kids to the park this afternoon if you'd like a break, or I'll go to the children's museum with your kids, or they can come to my house, I'll read books, I'll color with them, or whatever, anything that you could offer that would help with childcare would make a big difference, just to create little spaces in time for the grieving person, to be alone and to find spaces. Now, still, I was having a hard time talking about my grief and talking about suicide. Still, I couldn't say the word suicide. I could not say it. I couldn't tell anyone about the suicide. I could not ask anyone directly for help or tell anyone what I was dealing with. It sounds really sad, and maybe it sounds pathological. I don't know when I think about it, but still, it was the stigma that I was feeling, and the fear of shame, of being shamed by other people. I could have used more education about grief itself and grief after suicide. Again, even though I was a doctor, I received no education in my training about grief. It would have been very helpful to me if I had had something I could read. I actually looked for books about grief after suicide. I couldn't find very much back at that time. And again, that's one reason I wanted to share this experience now, in case there are people out there saying, I wish I understood grief after suicide better. Not that my experience is emblematic of what other people may go through, but at least I'm able to share with you what it was like for me from one person's perspective. I realize now I could have used support from other people who had experienced a suicide death. I found it strange to be around other people who were grieving different types of death, because, again, the experience of suicide is a little different. It's traumatic, but it's also such a huge feeling of betrayal and abandonment, intentional abandonment, the fact that it's an intentional type of death. And there's so much guilt involved in grief after suicide, and again, stigma and shame. And so I felt that I didn't fit in necessarily with other people who were grieving other types of death. It just felt like I could not feel resonance with those people. And I've wondered, what would it have been like to be in a group, a support group, perhaps with other people who had experienced suicide. And then I thought, oh, the ideal would be a group where we gathered together in a circle and no one said anything. We just all sat together shaking our heads like, yes, I understand. You don't need to talk about it. It's okay. I know how it feels. Like, that would probably have been my ideal support group, a silent group of people who were able to just sit and be together, be present in their grief, and know, like, yep, I'm going through it too. I understand. I understand that you don't want to talk about it, and you don't want to tell the story, and you don't want anyone to judge. You just need to know that you're not alone. I think that would have been the most helpful thing to me at that time, to know that I was not alone. So I carried on for 3 years, as I said, in this state. And what went through my mind for those year two and year three is that I wanted everything to go back to the way it had been before my dad died, and I believed that it would. I was waiting for that to happen. I would say that to myself, like, if I'd wake up in the morning, I'd feel the tsunami again, I'd feel myself being pulled under, and I would think, "One day, I'm gonna wake up and this will be gone. I won't feel this. It will be just like it was before. I'll be back like I was before, and everything will be fine." That's what I wanted, and that's what I was wishing for every day, and it took me a long time to realize that that is not how grief works, and that is not how you deal with grief. You don't sit and wait for it to somehow magically disappear and go away, because it doesn't go away. And what I was wishing is that things hadn't changed since before my dad died. I was wishing that nothing would be changed. I could go back and just recreate everything as it was before. And I was resisting the need to change. And that's what I had to discover next on this journey, is that, of course, grief changes you. Of course, when someone you love deeply, the first one of the first people you've ever loved in your life, dies, and when they die intentionally and take their own life, of course, it changes everything. It changes everything outside of you, and it changes everything inside of you. That was the wisdom I didn't have yet during those 3 years that I needed to gain. And at the end of 3 years, what happened is that I knew I was not navigating my grief in the best way possible. I knew that I needed something else. I didn't know what it was. I had no idea, but one day I got an inspiration that I should call hospice, and that maybe I should volunteer with hospice. At the time, I hardly even knew what hospice did or was. I didn't know if we had a hospice in our community, but this inspiration came to me, and I decided, that's what I will do. I will see if we have a hospice, and maybe I can be a volunteer. And I don't know why. I didn't know why I was seeking out hospice. I just had this intuition that somehow this is my path forward. This is what is going to help me take my next steps in this process of grief. So the long story short, I called the hospice in our community. Their medical director had just resigned that very day, and I became their medical director as a volunteer that day, knowing nothing about hospice, nothing about the dying process, nothing whatsoever. But that hospice took me in, actually, and they trained me. I got to meet all these amazing nurses who'd been working there for years and caring for dying patients. I just really submersed myself in death and dying and grief, and it was incredible. And so I became a volunteer. I came to IDT meetings. I came and started visiting a few patients here and there. And the moment I did that, the moment I saw my first patient and sat with them, I realized this is the kind of medicine that I was meant to practice all along. This is the kind of doctor I was meant to be. And at that same time, what was happening in my medical practice and my personal life is that things were beginning to fall apart. I'd been, hiding from my grief for 3 years. I'd been holding all the pieces together, struggling every day to just show up, be at work, do everything, be trying to be a perfect mom, trying to be a perfect doctor in the office, trying to do everything that was expected for me to do, carrying out my little spiritual practice every day, which was where I tended to my grief. Now I was adding on being a volunteer director for hospice. And this was a really big change, because hospice was beginning to open me up on the inside to even more of my grief feelings, beginning to push me toward experiencing more of the pain of my grief and going deeper into it. And the first thing that I discovered, of course, is that grief comes for everyone. Everyone experiences grief and loss. And of course, death is a natural part of life. And after sitting with patients and families and seeing their suffering and seeing their pain, I recognize like I am not alone in this at all. My dad's suicide death may be creating some different things for me to deal with than other people, but it's not totally different. And everyone is suffering and everyone is going through grief. Everyone I see here in hospice is feeling pain and figuring out how to live with it and how to navigate it. And some people are figuring out how to die. They're figuring out how to take their last steps through life and live their last days and how to make meaning of their lives. And I, I I began to recognize, as I said, I'm not alone. This is part of life. This is a life lesson. Dealing with loss of this intense, it is part of what life is here to teach us. And I could actually learn things and I could actually grow as a person and become my best self in a sense if I can be with this pain, all of this pain that is there for me. If I can be with it, there there are things for me to learn and things for me to know. And that's one of the first things that I discovered through my work in hospice, and it was so valuable and so helpful to me at that time. And I learned, of course, that the reason I hurt so much is because I loved my dad so much. And I wanted my love to be enough to keep my dad alive, to save my dad, to heal my dad, but it couldn't do that. It wasn't possible. And so I was learning about having a broken heart, and that actually part of this life journey is that we get broken. Part of it is part of life is when we love other people, we are going to be hurt. Like love makes us vulnerable and opens us to pain and loss. So I recognize that my broken heart was also a normal part of life. And that part of life's journey is figuring out, how do I put the pieces together? How do I hold them together? How do I hold my heart together? How do I begin to hold my life together in a way that lets me keep living, but also lets me keep loving and learning and growing? How do I stay vulnerable, stop walling myself off and preventing myself from feeling anything? How do I feel it, feel the love and feel the pain of this broken heart and continue to go about my life? So, this was happening during these years that I got started in hospice. And I recognized at that time what I said is that I could use more support, but I wasn't sure where to get it. I did get support by being with patients and their family members in hospice from the IDT team, but I did not directly ask for support for my grief. I didn't talk about the fact that I was grieving or how my dad had died. I didn't share that with people. And I began to feel ready and feel a need to talk about my dad's death, but I didn't know where to go. And so, two things happened at this time, which were very interesting. One is I read about a group, a support group that was forming, kind of a therapy group for women doctors who had issues with their mothers. And I did have issues with my mother always, my whole life. My mom and I had had a really tense relationship, and that had gotten much worse since my dad's death. And we were really struggling to communicate and connect after my dad's death. So, this support group for women doctors made some sense to me because, well, I could sort of peripherally get support for my dad's death, but I would actually just be talking about my mom and my relationship with her, but I would be in a place where I would feel supported. The other reason I wanted to take part in this group is because we were all doctors, and being a doctor, there's a certain amount of pressure that comes from being a doctor that makes it really hard to be in an everyday group with normal people who have normal types of jobs and work, and that sometimes it's because of other people's expectations of what you should know or how you should be as a doctor. Sometimes it's our own expectations, not wanting to let down my guard, not wanting to share my vulnerability with people um, who don't know me very well. But being in a group of all women doctors meant we had something in common. We were all used to hiding. We were all used to putting up a facade for our patients that we had to let down in order to have honest conversations with people. So we were all in the same boat. And that group was helpful, though I did not address my dad's suicide. Oddly enough, how did I not talk about it very much? I don't know. Um, but I found support and help in that group. And that went on a weekly basis for a number of months. So this was at the same time as I had started volunteering in hospice. All of this was happening at once. I was finding myself ready to talk, ready to get help, trying to figure out where that help might reside. At that very same time, in my medical practice, my family practice office, I had three patients, three women patients who were all psychiatric patients with complex mental health diagnoses. They'd all three been in and out of psychiatric hospitals. They were all not functioning very well in their lives, living sometimes in halfway houses or in difficult circumstances. And they were all my family practice patients. But I began to recognize that they were all very lonely. And one of their issues that they struggled with is not having anyone who understood them, except it seemed me. They could come to my office and talk to me, and I was their support. But I realized they needed more than that. And so I created a support group for those three patients in my office, and we met over my lunch hour. It was a free support group. We met once a week on Thursdays during my lunch hour, and I sat with them. And we came together, and they had a place where they could talk and they could share their experiences and their vulnerabilities. And it was very revealing to me and very interesting. I mean, really an amazing experience. And I actually found these three women to be so much more open and willing to talk honestly about what they had experienced than I found my women doctor friends in the other support group. I found we women doctors had a much harder time sharing openly and honestly with each other than these three psychiatric patients had sharing with each other. So that group also went on for months. So simultaneously, I was in two groups and I was volunteering with hospice and continuing my medical practice. And one day, I remember it so clearly in my little Thursday lunchtime group with my psychiatric patients. One day, they used a talking stick. They would pass back and forth to each other to take turns talking and telling their stories. One day, one of them brought the stick to me and she said to me, "What is hurting you?" And all three of them looked at me, and and I was a little bit shocked and stunned, like, what? Like, no, I'm the facilitator. I'm not a group member. I facilitate this group. But here I am holding the talking stick, and they were all looking at me. And they said to me, "We know that you are hurting." And I was stunned because I hadn't said anything that would imply to them. I hadn't told them anything about myself or any of my story, but somehow they saw it and they felt it and they just sat with me. And finally, I just told them my dad died by suicide and I'm still dealing with grief over it. And those three women that day sat with me in silence, which again, that was my my ideal support group. They sat silently. And, one of them brushed tears from her eyes and they just sat there with me. They just sat. And they looked at me. Sometimes they looked at me with this like love and support. And I felt this like complete understanding from them, which is amazing. I felt them like connecting with me in a way my women doctor support group had not connected with me. And there I was telling the truth and saying the word suicide and being honest about my grief. And these three women just completely, I felt completely embraced and safe and held in this little makeshift group in my office. And so that kind of opened the floodgates for me because I had talked about suicide and talked about my grief and talked about my pain after years of not talking about it. It's kind of amazing when I think about it, but that is what finally opened the doors. And I didn't talk about it in that group. The group was for them, it was for the patients. After that, I wasn't there to get support for me. But the fact that I had been able to tell someone and be open and vulnerable was really important to me. And it began to shift things much more quickly for me. I became much more open in hospice and much more open to feeling the pain of my patients and sharing their pain and resonating with their grief and seeing what they were going through. Um, it opened up my compassion for others and my ability to be present with grief. And uh, it was amazing for me to see that happen. But the other thing that it opened up in me that I recognized, the next layer that I dove into in my grief was that I was very, very angry. And all of those years when I was compartmentalizing my grief and not able to look at it, what I was hiding was anger at my father for taking his life. And I had just refused to feel my own anger because it felt wrong to me. I didn't feel that it felt hurtful and unloving and uncaring for me to be angry at my dad. I knew he was suffering. I knew he'd been in pain. I didn't feel that I had a right to be angry at him, and I didn't want to be angry. So I had simply buried it. And again, I'd grown up my whole life learning how to bury anger because my family didn't deal with anger directly. But once I opened things up and began to feel all of my feelings and to process them and allow them to be part of my grief experience, anger definitely came to the surface. And I was shocked by it, alarmed. I didn't know what to do about it, but it was there, and I utilized anger in my writing, and that's one of the places I'm still writing a lot. So one of the places that I expressed my anger and processed it was through writing because it was very safe to write about my anger, and so the writing became instrumental for me in dealing about my anger. And one day, I wrote something to my dad on a piece of paper that said, "You didn't just take your own life, you killed me too." And it was pretty powerful for me to write that. And that message to my dad, I guess, to say, look at this outcome, look what's happened, look how devastated my life has been. But once I expressed it and put that on paper, wrote out my anger at my dad, it began to dissipate fairly quickly. I began to move through it, and I began to see that it wasn't something that I wanted to hold on to or even could hold on to, because as soon as I gave voice to the anger, it began to melt away from me, and I began to find my way through that. And what came for me next was to learn about forgiveness. And that's what I reached very quickly for my dad, is to begin working on forgiveness for my dad and understanding him and everything he had been through, and also forgiving myself for not being able to save my dad, forgiving the psychiatrist who took care of my dad, forgiving my mom, my brother, everyone involved in my dad's life, forgiving all of this whole process. That I became flooded with this these thoughts of forgiveness and compassion for other people and the need to forgive. And I began writing about forgiveness as well. And that was a powerful lesson I was learning through my hospice patients as well, and seeing them f- practicing forgiveness at the end of life and needing to learn about forgiveness. So that became my next task that I worked on. And forgiveness really helped me deal with the anger that I'd been holding on to for my dad. Um, and and also helped me begin to connect with my family better. I also was learning how to simply be present, because that was something I hadn't really been good at before in my life. But I had learned this value of being able to sit in silence with people, and found it so helpful when I could do that with my patients. So just being here in the moment, right here, right now, in the present moment, and sitting with people, and the comfort of just being silent and knowing not everything has to be talked about, not everything has to be verbalized. There is this incredible strength and power in sitting in silence and saying nothing. And of course, I had had that demonstrated to me, the times when other people had supported me silently. And next, I began also looking at purpose and kind of understanding how all of the events of my life fit together in certain ways, and that there was something so deep and so powerful for me to learn through this grieving process I was going through over my dad's death. And just finding hospice and seeing that there was so much there for me in terms of learning and healing. And but seeing also that hospice was a path I was on, and it was a learning path. It was a path where I was uncovering wisdom and discovering wisdom for life. I was changing how I lived. I was changing my mindset. I was changing my spirituality and my awareness of what matters in life. All of that was happening and growing within me over these years that I was doing hospice work. And I'm talking about years here. This did not happen suddenly, but this is over a process of several years of work in hospice ongoing. Eventually, during that time, I quit doing my family practice. For one thing, so my women doctors group came to an end. My group with the mental health patients came to an end. One of them moved away. Another one moved. One moved to a completely different town. Another one moved to a different location, and had a hard time coming in for the group. And we also had decided that we had finished our group. We had accomplished what we needed in that group, and that it was time to end it. That came to an end. And at the same time, I came to a realization that I didn't want to do my family practice anymore. I wanted to focus solely on hospice. So I made a huge change, and I left my medical practice behind and became a full time hospice director. Again, still being a mom and a wife and a householder, but doing hospice work full time. And that was part of my learning how to surrender and how to go with the flow of life, because recognizing, as much as in the past I used to want to go backwards and go back to an earlier time in life when things felt easier and happier, I learned that life has its own momentum and its own flow, and things happen. Things are hard. We get dashed. we go under the waves. We get pulled down, but we also come back up again. And that when we don't resist the flow of life, but we can engage in the flow of life, it goes more easily, it goes more smoothly. And that is how I began to approach my grieving, is to not resist it so much, to go with it, to be in the flow of my own grief process and accept whatever was coming up. Some days I felt like crying, some days I felt overwhelmed and non-functional, some days I felt uh, amazing, some days I had insights, I felt wise, I felt incredible and full of life and full of energy and love. But it vacillated, and it was all over the place in every direction. But I learned that that was the flow of my grief, and I just had to go with it. And I had to stop fighting it and stop resisting and stop trying to go backwards. And then through my hospice work, one of the most profound lessons was just learning how precious life itself is in each moment of life. And I'm sharing a picture right now for those of you who can't see it. It's like a picture of um, what is this? It's like a type of a dandelion that has gone to seed already, but it's first thing in the morning when there are dewdrops on the tiny little stems and fronds, and those dewdrops are only present for a short moment. As soon as the sun comes up and the temperature goes up, uh, they evaporate immediately. And so, this moment when the dew is still on these tiny little stems and branches, like, you have to be there and present. You have to notice it and see it, or you'll miss it entirely. It only lasts for a short while and then it vanishes and it's gone. And so this became for me the symbol of my whole life, that life is just a series of these moments, and I have to take them in. I have to pay attention and be aware of what's happening in every moment. And it might be that pain is present and I'm feeling it deeply, but I want to feel it. I want to feel all of it, whatever it is. And it might be in the next moment that joy is present, or beauty, or love. And I want all of those moments. I want to feel all of them and be there for all of them, because life is fleeting and short, because in just a few seconds it will change and it will pass. And so this lesson of impermanence became so powerful for me, as I realized that even my grief is impermanent. What I'm experiencing from my grief today isn't going to last. So I will take all of it. I receive it and embrace it and accept whatever grief brings me today, because it will vanish, it will be gone, and there will be something different tomorrow, something new and different that will come into my life. And so those those experiences, those lessons I described, became this book, The 7 Lessons for Living from the Dying, which eventually I wrote. And it all came from my grief process. All it's full of stories of my hospice work and how I learned and grew and began to heal my grief during that process. And writing this book was a way of looking back. It was a 12-year process of reviewing my hospice work and all of these lessons. And writing the book itself was part of the healing that I went through and that I experienced for my grief, going as deep as I had ever been into my grief and healing it. And it was incredibly powerful. But at the same time as I was writing this grief, by now I had moved into a different life experience. I was back to being a volunteer for hospice. We'd moved to a different community that didn't need me as a paid medical director. I was just a volunteer for them. I was back doing family practice in a clinic. And the year that I was writing the book, 7 Lessons for Living from the Dying, in one of those years, a young patient of mine at this clinic died of H1N1 flu, which was passing through our community at the time. His death sent me into the deepest, quickest spiral I had ever been involved in, down back into the depths of my grief. I grieved for having a patient die, but I grieved all over again for my dad's death. And what was predominantly coming to the surface was guilt and feeling that it was my fault. I couldn't save my young patient and I couldn't save my dad. And this was a whole new aspect of my grief that I had not yet traversed on this journey. And so many years after his death, and I got plunged into guilt, which has been quite a long process. And I'm still working on it now. I'm still working through the guilt. And I ended up leaving that medical practice job. And still, I work on guilt, which is enormous and overwhelming and huge. And it's guilt as a medical doctor, which is something that maybe not everyone would understand, but the guilt of having a vow and a responsibility to save lives And to have a patient die in a way that to me felt unnecessary. It felt that we should have been able to save this boy's life, and to not be able to accomplish that uh, was devastating. And so, again, as I said, plummeted me to the depths. And once again, I began that journey of grief and working through guilt this time. And this is going to result in another book that I'm going to write, that I'm beginning work on right now, about the guilt that will be part of my healing process for that guilt. But at that same time, I began to do another exploration of my dad's death. By then, I was doing this podcast, and I had decided that I wanted to do a little series on my dad's suicide surviving the aftermath. So I began investigating my dad's death, asking lots of questions, interviewing my dad's sisters who were still alive, and my mom and my brother, looking back through my dad's military records and getting information about dad's life and things that might have contributed to his suicide, because I realized I really wanted to know. I had so many questions inside of me about his death, and part of helping me with guilt was to understand all of the combined facets of his death, all of the forces that came together, so that I could remove from myself this sense of blame that somehow I was responsible for his death. I could see that his death came from many, many, many factors in his life. I investigated his relationship with my mom. I looked at his love for guns and gun ownership, his service in the military, and he had a gun collection. He loved guns, and he was an excellent marksman, even in the military. I looked at his work life, his relationship to work, and the fact that he was retiring from work at the time that he took his life. I went on a trip to visit Normandy, where my dad had been part of the landing on Omaha Beach. I did a huge amount of searching and research to understand all of these factors that were part of my dad's death. I came up with an anatomy of his suicide, which I talk about a lot when I do workshops on suicide. But it combined many factors: childhood wounds, his status as a veteran with untreated trauma, his own unhealed grief, chronic pain, relationship issues, alcohol use, retirement and aging, a loss of purpose, financial difficulties, access to firearms. All of those factors were present for my dad when he decided to end his life. And so it was really helpful to me to understand that suicide is it's complex and multifactorial, and so many, many different threads from all of a person's life feed into the decision to end one's life. As part of this process of learning about suicide, I met with a colleague of mine who is a psychiatrist and also a shaman, and he works with veterans a lot. And he taught me a ritual that he does with veterans to help them retrieve their souls. And he uses fire and has them write down the ways in which their soul was lost in the past, and they burn it in the fire in order to release their soul from whatever has been holding it. And so I did this ritual with fire for my dad, and I wrote on slips of paper all the pain and all the wounds my dad had through his life, and I burned them one by one, and I asked that my dad be released from those. And this was a very powerful ritual for me that helped me with my grief. It helped me feel that I was doing something, something spiritual and energetic that would also help release my dad. Over those years, I did many different rituals. I One of my favorites was to gather wildflowers down by streams and drop them into the stream. And I had letting go rituals when I would drop the flowers one by one and watch them float away. And I did that many times for my dad's death. Um, Over the years, my niece died of breast cancer. I did this. This was actually from the ritual I did for her when she died. And there have been other losses for which I've done similar rituals, and it's been very, very powerful for me with my grief. Over the years, this is my family cabin that my dad built up in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. We visited the cabin many times, and many times this was the scene of me processing grief and reconnecting with my dad and loving him and loving this place that he built and that he loved so much. And so this place, being able to come here and go for hikes and go fishing like my dad did, played a huge role in my grief. However, we ended up a few years ago having to sell it, which was another grief process. And this is my mom. I reconnected with my mom and was able to help her through her later years and spend a lot more time with her. She and I found a lot of forgiveness and healing with each other, reconnected in really powerful ways. This was her birthday that I celebrated with her about a year and a half before she died. And so many, many things took place on this healing journey connected to my dad and my grief over my dad, additional grief that has come on in layers. Still, I'm processing it now. And but I'm at peace and I embrace the grief. I'm calm with it. I feel contentment. I feel joy in my life. I don't feel broken anymore by the grief. I feel that it has become a part of me that I accept and I welcome. And though they're still painful lessons, I also welcome and embrace those lessons. What I learned from my grief experience, first of all, for me, the grieving my dad's death has been a solitary experience. I have felt that it has been mine alone to navigate. I'd have had my own very unique journey through this grief. No one was on this path with me. It has been mine, and that honestly, no one else could make this journey better or worse for me. It's been mine to make of it whatever it would become. It wasn't anyone else's responsibility to help me or be there for me. And I don't blame anyone who showed up for me or didn't show up for me. I honestly believe that what people said to me didn't make a difference. It didn't help me and it didn't hurt me. And so I see a lot of people emphasizing what you should say to a grieving person, what you shouldn't say to a grieving person. And you know what? Silence helped me more than anything. But yes, there were people who said some things that showed their lack of information sometimes, that showed their lack of sensitivity. But that didn't make my grief any worse. My grief was already horrible. No one could make my grief worse by something they said. And but also no one could make my grief better by something they said either. So I think as supporters of someone grieving, we have to give up believing there's some right or wrong thing to say and accept that maybe saying nothing is the perfect thing. It was for me. Silence was my best friend. And I would say rely on that. Trust yourself. Be silent. If you don't know what to say, that's probably an indicator that silence is the right thing. And uh, as I said, I didn't then and I don't now blame any people who could not show up for me. What I understand is that a suicide was brand new for me in my life, and it was for all the people around me who might have been support people for me. They'd never experienced having a friend who had a loved one die by suicide. They didn't know what to do or how to react, and were dealing with all their own discomfort and questions and disbelief and even their own grief over my dad's death. And so if they couldn't be there to support me, they had their own work to do. They were in their own process, experiencing their own thing. I didn't really blame them. I didn't feel an expectation that somehow other people should be there for me. And I still don't, because again, I viewed this as my own process that I was going through. So I then had compassion. I still have a great deal of compassion and grace for anyone who tried to help and anyone who could not help and who could not show up and couldn't be there, because I couldn't go to them. I couldn't go to them and ask them to help me. I couldn't go to them and tell them what I was suffering through. So we were each just doing the best we could try in this process, trying to get through it day by day. My advice to you, if you want to offer support to someone who's grieving a suicide death, would be to show up if you can. If you are able to be there, if you can overcome whatever your fear and discomfort is, or your shock or shame or your own grief, and be there, show up if you can. Um, but if you can't show up, it's an opportunity. If you simply cannot do it, you can't go to the person's house. You cannot make a phone call. You cannot do it. It's too painful and too hard for you. Use it as a learning opportunity. Ask yourself, like, why? What is it that you might learn from this experience? What is it that you could gain from for yourself? Do you need to learn more about suicide? Do you need to understand more about grief after suicide? Do you need to look at the taboos in our society around suicide and the stigma and the shame, and what have you been taught about it? And are there different ways of looking at it than you may have been taught? So use it as a learning opportunity, and you can explain later. I had friends come back to me even a few years later and say, I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. I realized you probably needed help, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't. And I appreciate that. I understood that. And again, I have compassion and grace for that. I would say don't worry about what to say. If the reason you're not showing up is because you aren't sure what to say, don't worry about it. Just go and be there. Know that silence might be the perfect thing and might be very welcome. So don't worry. You might stumble, you might say something and worry that it was the wrong thing. Honestly, you can't make someone's grief worse than it is. And you're not necessarily going to make their grief better. You may help them get through another 30 minutes or another hour of one of their days of grief by being there. I still say offer food. For me, best thing ever. Offer childcare, offer help with cleaning, or transportation or errands. Offer all of that type of support. It could make a really big difference, in my opinion. This is how I view it. I also say don't ask too many questions about the death unless it's obvious the griever wants to tell the story, especially in the early days, because as I found, talking about it was re-traumatizing. And I needed to hold that story within me for a long time before it felt safe to talk about it, before I could talk about it like I do now without feeling devastated all over again as I described it. So that is my story that I wanted to share with you today. Um, I hope that it's been helpful to you listening. Again, I don't know who will listen. I realize some people won't because it will feel too scary to listen to a talk about suicide and grief after suicide. But um, I needed to share it right now this week as I'm processing once again the anniversary of my dad's death. And it's been helpful to me to talk it through. So if anyone's listening, thank you. Thanks for being there as my listener once again. And again, I don't necessarily need silence anymore. If you need to reach out to me or you want to ask me questions, I'm able to do that now. So feel free to ask me that as well. And if you've been here all this time and you've been listening in, I thank you, and I really appreciate your presence and your support. It makes a really big difference to me. I hope you enjoyed what I had to share there. If you're still here and you're listening in, I really appreciate you. Thanks a lot for listening in. That means a lot to me. And again, tell other people about this episode if it's something that you think other people could use. I don't see very much information out there really about suicide and grief after a suicide death, and that's why I wanted to share it. So thanks again for being here with me. Don't forget to subscribe and come back next week. I'll be back with an interview next week to share with you. So until then, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you next. and love each and every moment of your precious life. Bye bye.